Hey watch friends, today we're going to check out a prototype from the Italian micro brand Bramier, and this is their Apex Rock, specifically in its limited edition form. As of time of publishing, this one is already actually live on their website. I'll of course have a link down the video description. It's currently on pre-order for $439, but it will actually be shipping here soon. So look, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive straight into this. But before we do, if you saw that banner at the top, while this is a prototype that they loaned into the channel, they do intend to send me a production version, and I always, of course, want to be upfront about that. As far as the case, measured from roughly the 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock position, this is coming in at 39.9 millimeters. The bezel actually steps out and is coming in at 40.4 millimeters. The lugs are a strap change friendly 20 millimeters. The lug to lug is a reasonably compact 46.4 millimeters. The total thickness, inclusive of the crystal, is coming in at 12.3 millimeters. Not bad for the water resistance that we'll look at here momentarily. As far as the crystal, it is a flat sapphire crystal, and it does feature an inner AR coating. For the movement, this one is beating away with a Miyota 9015. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a great reliable movement. You're looking at automatic, hacking, hand winding, higher beat of 28,800 beats per hour, around a 42-hour power reserve, all that kind of good stuff. Definitely one of my favorite movements. As far as the water resistance, this is coming in at 300 meters or 30 atmospheres of water resistance. So for that just over 12 millimeter thickness, I think that's plenty respectable. The weight on this included bracelet is coming in at 141.8 grams. That is sized to my 6.5 inch wrist. Do note, we'll come back to it. That's with this clasp. The clasp is going to be changed over, so that might change slightly there. Alright, so now that we have the basic specs out of the way, let's go ahead and dive deeper, get a better feel for this one before we wrap it up, do some comps, and then look at my version of the pros as well as some critiques. First, the biggest thing that you're going to notice with this is, of course, the cracked ice texture that this has across the dial. This is a different variation than we've seen with some others in that it is not a carve, it's actually kind of printed onto the screen there, or onto the dial. With that being said, you're going to notice the base coloration is kind of an off-white, which I do think is reminiscent of a snow. It's not that real pure white, but it certainly isn't like a gray coloration either. What you will have, though, is those gray veins or striations going around the texture. With that, as far as that textural play, you're going to notice that this actually picks up a little bit of an iridescent kind of effect. So sometimes those lines look a little more like a dark gray, sometimes they look like a light gray, and as you get that kind of satiny shimmer from that off-white dial, it really has a cool effect. So hopefully you're capturing or seeing some of that as we try to capture that here across this video footage, but it really does look pretty cool in person, especially for actually just being a printed style application for that. Speaking of applications here, you can see at the 12 o'clock position, there is the applied logo. And then down below that, you have the printed brand name, as well as 2 lines of printed text down at the 6 o'clock position. And that sits just right above the date window. As you can see here, the date window is just going to be a basic square cutout for that. It does have a little bit of a beveled edge, which does make that look a little more interesting. It is not what I would call a color match in that it is a pure white, so it does definitely have some contrast. And that's where you can really see the off-white coloration versus the pure white that is on the date wheel. Out on the perimeter, you can see that this does have a rehot with a chapter ring on that. So you're going to see that it does have more pronounced hashes at the 5-minute increments, and then it has your individual hashes at the 1-minute increments as well. So plenty good for precision legibility there. Shifting over to the hardware on this is what I would describe as being a blunted lance type handset. That's for both your hour and your minute hand. You're going to notice they are prominently featured with lume that we'll actually look at here momentarily. Additionally, though, they do have a matte black or satiny kind of black texture to that, which I think adds great contrast against this white dial. So that is welcome there. With the second hand, you can see this is a traditional lollipop configuration. Towards the base, it's going to carry over with the same black texture, but then out towards the perimeter, you're going to see it matches the dial accent and has red to give, again, nice contrast, but a little bit of a color accent and pop there. Shifting over to the markers at the 12, 3, and 9 are what I would describe as being a reverse shield. By that I mean it's kind of an upside down shield pattern for it. I find that that's most noticeable at the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock position. At the 12 o'clock you can see that does have a line of separation there, so not only the different shape but also that line accent. That's going to make it very easy if you're picking this up at nighttime to distinguish which way is top and which way is bottom here. Looking at the rest of these, you can see for all the rest, with the exception of the 6 o'clock, you're going to be looking at circular for those markers. And then down at the 6 o'clock, to accommodate the date window, it does have a semicircle down there. As far as the actual loom, the loom performance on this, it's BGW9 all the way around. That's inclusive of the bezel as well as all the markers and the handset. I found the loom actually performs quite well in this. I was pleasantly surprised there. It's a nice strong application of BGW9, so really nothing to complain about in that regard. As far as the light play, with having some of this dial texture, while it doesn't have the depth that some of the carved dials do, I still do find that it gets decent light play to it. I do think that if this were a carved texture, it would have a more pronounced light play, but still not too bad there, and that's something that transitional lighting, you don't generally encounter that frequently. Shifting over to the bezel on this is going to be what I would describe as a wide coin edge. So you can see it is definitely a coin edge styling, but it's a little bit wider for the ridges as opposed to the more traditional configuration. Being a dive style watch, this is a 120 click unidirectional bezel, and we'll check out that action here momentarily. The bezel insert is a polished black ceramic, so as you can see, nice gloss application for that. It does have inlaid into that, as we already saw for the loom, but it does have your hashes or your markers all the way around. So you can see it has kind of that upside down or that top of a triangle there for your arrow at the pip position. Then you have your 5-minute increments through 20, and then it shifts over for your 30, 40, and 50 at 10-minute increments. As far as the bezel action, let's go ahead and listen to that. Decently tactile click. It's, I think, pretty well dialed in. It's definitely a little bit on what I would call the light side, and it has a touch of play because of that. It's not real bad as far as back play. It does just kind of settle into place a little bit, and then getting that lined up with that style for it's a little bit harder than it would be with a traditional or completed triangle there, or actually downward facing with the arrow like it normally is towards that. However, I don't find it's too bad. You sometimes end up a single click past where you intend to be. But overall, I think the action on that is pretty decent. As far as the case on this is what I would describe as being a slab kind of construction. As you can see here, pretty uniform as far as the overall finishing of that. The texture on this is going to be brushing, and that's horizontal brushing running the front to rear on the case, though it is broken up with, as you can see, it does have polished chamfers that increase in size at the top of the lugs, and then additionally it does have an undercut as well. Not only does that visually slim that out, but I do appreciate that they break that up a little bit with having just the solid brushing across there, so I think that's pretty well incorporated. With the case shape, you can see it does have a very subtle downturn to it. So it wears a little bit flat, however the case back is pretty nicely tucked. So to that end, I do think the downturned lugs are pretty sufficient. As you'll see in some wrist footage, it does get still a touch of that flying saucer effect, almost more like a teeter-totter kind of effect on my particular wrist, though of course that's going to vary depending on your wrist shape and those kind of things. As far as the lugs themselves, I think that these are well-proportioned lugs. I think for the 40mm sizing, I think these fit the overall. They don't look too petite, nor do they look too chunky. And then again, you can see from this angle with that lug cut, I think that visually is always a nice touch as well. It does have just a traditional curvature in between the lugs. And then at the 3 o'clock side, it does not feature a crown guard, which I think is just fine for this styling. Yes, it's a dive style watch, but I don't think it's any issue here. As far as the crown itself, this is coming in at 6.8 millimeters. It is a screw down crown, as I'm sure you'd expect with a 300 meters of water resistance. It carries through, again, with that coin styling. You can see this is a little bit tighter of a pattern, but I believe that that's just owing to the size, but I think it matches the bezel texture pretty well. And then the finishing, you're looking at polishing all the way around, and it is signed, just like we saw on the dial, with their logo there on the exterior. Shifting over to the case back, as you, again, would probably expect for a dive style watch with 300 meters, this is a screw-in case back. It is solid in construction. You're going to be looking at a triple texture here where you have brushing on the exterior, then you have mirror polish, and then you do have blasting to set off the accents there, both for the text as well as for the accent in the middle there. Specifically, you're looking at what I would describe as like a mountain or with the namesake being a glacier as well. So I think that's a nice homage to the front, and I think that ties in pretty well. Shifting over to the bracelet on this is tapered from 20 millimeters at the lugs down to 18 millimeters at the clasp. They describe it as a beads of rice, though the center is a little bit flat for traditional beads of rice, but it is certainly reminiscent of that style. This is a 7-link construction. You're going to be looking at brushing on the exterior links, and then on the interior smaller links, you are looking at polished accents as well. This does have fitted end links. As you can see, solid type design there, and is well incorporated for the lug curvature as well as with the case itself. There are no quick release spring bars on the back of this. Additionally, it is held in with pins. So while that can be a little bit more finicky to adjust, I will have a toolkit link down in the video description if you need some help there. But that being said, the nice thing about pins is you never have to worry about those backing out. So certainly adjusting up front is a little bit harder, but then they're pretty much set it and forget it, which that part's nice. As far as the articulation on this is actually surprisingly pretty fantastic. Though I say surprisingly, I really shouldn't be surprised because I find, generally speaking, beads of rice type designs or 7-link designs like this, especially with shorter links, are almost always going to have great articulation, which makes them, I think, very comfortable on wrist. Additionally, this has a pretty nice chamfer on the interior, so I don't have any hot spots or any sharp edges or anything along those lines. As for the clasp, I'm really not going to spend too much time talking about this clasp because this, unfortunately, is a pretty poor example of a clasp. However, I have been told by the brand that this was actually just a temporary one. They didn't mention that up front for it, but when I mentioned that the clasp was pretty terrible for this, they did say the styling on this, as you can see, it's just a stamped design. The biggest thing is this actually, it's tough to close there. It pops free on its own. Pretty basic as far as the toolless or the micro adjustment. But I will have an image popped up on the screen. I'm not certain what the final clasp is going to be like as far as the bridge. It does definitely have traditional micro adjust, but we'll come back to that. It certainly does look like a significant improvement over this particular version. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and bring in a few comps, and then from there, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. First, this is next to a Zealandic Iceborne that we've checked out previously. I wanted to bring this in because this obviously is another take on a glacier or an ice, cracked ice kind of effect, but this is done in the more traditional manner like Strom with a carved dial for it. So this just gives you an idea of the depth difference in the way that the light plays with that. I do think that this gets a nice effect going as far as the way that shifts with the gray, but certainly this does have more depth and more actual texture and 3D elements to that. Bring in next. Here it is next to a Zelos Mako GMT, and this one's super subtle if you saw this video, but this does actually have a carved cracked ice texture, but they did a full loom on this, and the problem was I think they needed to increase the depth of that, so it made it a very subtle. You can especially see it when it's loom, but otherwise it's really tough to pick up that texture, so you can see it certainly does I think present more noticeably on the Bramier with that printing than it does on this particular one. And then here it is finally next to a Revelot. This is the Hex Mariner. This is a 42mm. I just wanted to bring it in just to give you kind of a size comparison here since we looked at a couple others that are closer to the 40mm. And this is their white meteorite for it, which gives a little bit of that same kind of illusion, but this is with meteorite striations as opposed to that kind of effect there with the printing. All right, so that should hopefully give you a much better idea for this model as well as kind of how this stacks up against some others. So let's go ahead and wrap things up with my personal view of the positives, some critiques, as well as the summary. First, for the positives, I do think the light play as well as the overall theming and texture, I'm a big fan of the cracked ice kind of effect. I think it is just a cool look, and I do think that this captures that pretty well. Additionally, the light play, I do think, as we just saw there, is pretty unique on this with the way it picks up that almost iridescence for the cracked ice effect, so that's pretty slick as well. As far as the legibility, with having the matte or satiny kind of black against this whitish dial, you do have excellent contrast. I think the legibility is very solid, and that's across all three hands, as well as looking at your hashes out in the re-hot. So really no complaints whatsoever on legibility, which is something you definitely want in a dive watch. And there's one caveat or asterisk to that we'll touch on momentarily. As already talked about, with the bracelet, while I can't speak to the clasp yet, that's currently a huge weak point that we'll come back to. The actual bracelet itself does have great articulation, so really nothing to complain about there. I think everyone will be happy with this in the way that it hugs and sits across the wrist. And then finally, for what you would want in a Tolly type watch, this has a very solid feel to it. Certainly it has a little bit of heft. It's what I'd put into the middleweight territory at a little over 140 grams. But this definitely has, I think, a pretty stout, pretty well built construction and feel to it. But what about some critiques? First, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the clasp, as I mentioned, I'm really hoping this is significantly improved because this is definitely, the standing clasp is just, it's not good. I mean, I can't really sugarcoat it for that. It is a pretty bad clasp. It's even from cheaper watches, it is definitely one of the more poor examples that I've seen here. So that's kind of disappointing they threw this on, but I get it. It's a prototype. It's a placeholder for it. I would have liked to have actually experienced the real clasp though, just so I could offer more meaningful feedback in that regard. But I'm sure that the production version is going to be much better. The bezel markings, for this, I would have liked to have seen that they had 5-minute hashes. I get and appreciate that they're going for a specific look with this aesthetic, but to me, going in 10-minute increments diminishes a lot of the functionality of the bezel, so I would have at least liked to have had 5-minute hashes for going all the way around. They didn't have to have the numerals, but they could have made some kind of little marker or indicator in there. As we already talked about the action, I think certainly they could tighten that up a little bit as far as the slight play that this has in it, but it's not too bad. I think they had a real missed opportunity with the dial on this. One thing that I think they really could have done to enhance this, if they could have kept that same kind of texture, I would have loved to have seen if they could have somehow incorporated, I don't know if it would have needed to be sandwich cutouts, which probably would have been far too much, but if they could have somehow made that where it was an effective lume application across the dial. So whether they went with a full lume that had that gray applied to it to where you'd get that kind of visual from the contrast or the negative space, or alternatively if they were able to somehow apply that grayish with some lume pigment to that, I think that would have been a really cool look. We've certainly seen things like that from MMI and otherwise where they've done some pretty intricate landscapes across. Now that was against the sapphire dial, but that definitely I think was a missed opportunity here, and I think that really could have accentuated this further for its nighttime performance, though again, the lume is no slouch here. So where does that leave us? For those who have always been kind of interested in the cracked ice kind of effect, but weren't necessarily sold on the carve option, I think this gives you a good alternative. I think it certainly does have that cracked ice feel and vibe to it, while obviously being a very different application and take than the traditional carved texture. So if you're looking for a dive watch that's stout and gives you that kind of cracked ice effect, this is definitely one worth checking out. So there you have it. I hope this has been helpful for you. If you did enjoy it, as always, do tap that like button. If you haven't already done so, smash that subscribe button. Finally, drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. Normally I'd say which one's your favorite color, but you've only got one color option available for this limited edition. But what do you think of the watch overall? Do you have any critiques beyond the ones that I said? What do you think about the critiques I listed? Those kind of good things. Thanks for watching.